Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth online seminars of Open Science of the Italian Reproducibility Network. And as always, I would like to start with thanking the Italian Association of Psychology, which permit us to host this seminar on their Zoom account. So we thank them for their help. And I would like to introduce you today's speaker, who is Tom Heyman. And Tom Heyman is an assistant professor at the KU Leuven, where he teaches in different research methods and statistic courses, as well as good and responsible research practices like pre-registration and data sharing. And he has also given seminars about open science framework and R Markdown. In his research, Tom Heyman studied the mental lexicon via semantic priming, language development, distributed semantic models, scalar implicatures, and publication practices. And currently, he focuses on sequential testing methods to investigate dishonesty, multiverse analysis, and he also examines whether science is indeed self-correcting. And so, Tom, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction. And let me start by sharing my screen. Should be able to see it all now. Yes, okay, excellent. So, I am Tom, now at the University of Leiden, by the way, no longer at KU Leuven.
Okay.
And I want to talk about useful instruments for open and collaborative research. But before I do, I want to ask you a question first. So if I say useful instruments for open and collaborative research, what tools or platforms or software do you know, or do you maybe already use in your own research? So that I can get an idea of what you already know, what you might not know yet. So if you can type in chat, I have a bit of an idea of what I deal with. And can be brought, yes. Science framework, GitHub. All right. Another, what was that GitHub? Interesting to know. There is some overlap with what I'm going to talk about, but also some different platforms that you might not have heard of, or different workflows that you are maybe not familiar with, or might not immediately think of when I say useful instruments for open and collaborative research. So this is the overview of the topics that I'll talk about. So first, I'll talk about Open Science Framework, which is apparently something you are, or several of you are familiar with. Then I'll talk about Code Ocean, and combined with R Markdown. So R Markdown, I see someone saying Jupyter Notebooks is somewhat similar, but with software R. And then I'll talk about approaches and workflows to achieve open and collaborative research. I'll talk about co-piloting, big team science, and I'll finish the talk by introducing adversarial collaborations. But before I do, I first want to start with a bit of a disclaimer. So as you saw in my overview of topics, I don't pretend to give an exhaustive overview of everything that is that's out there. For instance, I won't be covering GitHub, even though I do realize that this is also a very useful platform to do open and collaborative research. So I'm going to talk about stuff that I'm familiar with myself, that I've used throughout my research. So it's based on personal experience. However, it's I don't have per se a stake in any of these platforms. It's not that I've involved in the development of Open Science Framework or CodeOcean or any of the workflows that I'll talk about. So there isn't really a conflict of interest. It's stuff that I discovered throughout my career as a researcher that I think that might be useful for other researchers, especially at the start of their careers. So they are useful tools, I think. They are useful approaches. They're not flawless. So sometimes I also struggle with certain aspects. I think, wish that was here as well. So I'll mention them as well throughout the talk. If you have any questions, feel free to add them in the chat. There's also a Q&A at the end, so you can also save your questions for them. Of course, because I didn't develop these approaches myself, I'm not an expert in that sense, but I developed expertise through using it myself. So it's I think that's potentially an interesting approach or potential interesting way of looking at things. All right, let's start with the Open Science Framework. So for those of you who are not familiar with that, it looks a bit like this if you are going to the website. So Open Science Framework is a free and an open platform to support research and to enable collaboration. So it's managed by the Center of Open Science. It's completely free. You can create an account by going to the website and then sign up. Throughout this talk, I'm going to work with screenshots rather than showing a live demonstration, because I'm going to use different platforms and switching back and forth would be a bit of a challenge. So I'm using screenshots. Hopefully they are clearly visible, but if not, I will try to explain what you see so you can follow along as well if certain font is too small or anything like that. So when you create an account on the Open Science Framework, okay, they're clear, thank you. When you create an account on the Open Science Framework, the first thing you would typically want to do is create a project. And creating a project on the Open Science Framework is very similar to creating a folder on your computer, right? If you, for your research, you want to start a new project, you first think, what is the title of my project? That's the first thing that's asked here. And then the second thing, that's a relevant question, is where do you want to store that information? So Open Science Framework can be used to store files. Can be data, can be scripts, can be materials, can be stimuli, can be anything you want, basically. But you have to specify where you want to store that. What is the physical location of the servers? And this can be relevant, for instance, in terms of legislation. So typically, because I'm working in Europe, I pick Germany, Frankfurt, which is in Europe, because of legislation called GDPR. So that's the first thing you have to do. And when you hit the create button, you will basically get a blank page, which you can now start to structure. Same as with a folder on your computer, you can now add subfolders to that. Here, I don't have a blank page. This is an example of one of my projects to give you an idea how it could look like. But there can be various ways how you structure your projects in Open Science Framework. So at the top, you have the title of the project, and then you see the people who are contributing to it. So you can add contributors from different institutions. So that's a nice way to get to collaborate with researchers. And then here at the bottom right, you have an overview of the different components. So components are similar to folders. So here I have a folder called Materials and Procedure, Data, Analyses and Manuscript. But you can choose whatever name you want. You can, if you, for example, you have a project without any data, then obviously you don't need a folder with data. So it's entirely up to you how you want to structure your projects. By default, the projects on Open Science Framework are private. So at the bare minimum, you can use the Open Science Framework as a place to back up your files and share your files with contributors. However, if you say, okay, I also want to make these materials or these files publicly available for other researchers to reuse, then you can make the folder, the project, public. So here at the top right, you have the option to either say make private or make public. So here, this particular project is public, but you can choose to make it private. And again, by default, it is private. In addition, you can also say, I want to make certain components private and others public. Let's say you want to share materials and procedure, but you don't want to share data for some reason. Then you could say, okay, these components should be public, whereas this component should be private. So there's a lot of flexibility. Open Science Framework provides you with a blank page, and it's up to you to fill in the details and to give structure to your project. Now, as I mentioned, one of the interesting aspects is that it allows you to upload files to your project and to specific components. So here, for example, I have the data component, and I have the files that I uploaded under this data component. Now, there is a limit in terms of the file size that you can use on the Open Science Framework. It's 5 gigabytes, if I'm not mistaken. So which is a pretty large limit for every individual file, that is. But still, for some fields, that might be not enough. Like astronomy, for example, they have lots of data. These file sizes might not, meet that requirement of maximally 5 gigabytes. There's also a solution for that, in that the Open Science Framework also allows you to link to add-ons. So some of you mentioned GitHub, for example. Let's say you're already working in GitHub, but you want to connect to your Open Science Framework project. That is possible via these add-ons, and then you can say, enable this add-on. Or I saw someone mention, I think, Google Drive. You can say, okay, I store my data on Google Drive, but I want to connect it to the Open Science Framework. And then you can go to these add-ons and say enable. Now, depending on the settings and depending on which add-on, you have to be careful. If you, for instance, make changes to a file on the Open Science Framework, then it also might make those changes to the files on your Dropbox or your GitHub or your Google Drive. So that's a way to sort of get around this 5 gigabyte maximum file size problem. And also it can be useful in general to connect to these existing add-ons that you might already be working with. Now, another aspect you can use the Open Science Framework for is so-called registrations. And people, can you maybe type in chat whether you are familiar with the concept of a pre-registration? So just yes or no. So yes, if you've heard of pre-registration, no, if it's completely new. And that's certainly fine if it's new. All right. At least the people replying in chat have heard of it, so that's good. I'll very briefly say, for those of you who might not have heard of it, for pre-registration, the idea is that before you collected any data, ideally, you might want to specify which research question you're trying to answer, which hypothesis, if any, you are going to test, and how you're going to process and analyze your data. So that way, you can be very transparent and say, okay, this is my plan beforehand. Now I'm going to collect some data, and then ideally you're going to follow that plan, or you're maybe need to deviate from the plan because you didn't think of certain aspects in advance. But then at least it's all very transparent, and there is no, let's say, freedom to potentially choose the way you're analyzing or processing your data to arrive at a particular outcome. So on the Open Science Framework, you can make these kind of pre-registrations, which basically means you're taking a picture of your project at that time, and you're freezing everything. So you're, for example, you say, these are the materials we're going to use, this is the way we're going to process the data, and now I'm taking a picture of this that is no longer editable at this point. And then you can say, I'm going to make this registration either public immediately or public after some time. And on the Open Science Framework, you have a number of templates that help you with these kind of pre-registrations. So depending on the type of research you do, the type of data you're collecting, or the field you're in, you might want to select one of these templates. Or you can just go for an open-ended registration, and that basically just means you have a response box or a response window where you can put in any information you want, and you can just say, see the pre-registration document here, and then you have a whatever file you have there, which specifies your decisions regarding your registration. So there are different options there. As I mentioned, you can choose between making it public immediately or keeping it private. That can be for up to 4 years. So you can say, make it public immediately or keep it private for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or maximally 4 years. And then it will automatically become public. So that's the idea of pre-registration. And that's something that is very easy to accomplish through the Open Science Framework. Now, there are many other things you can do with the Open Science Framework. They also host preprints, so preprint servers rather, for certain fields, like PsycArchive for psychology, and many others. And so a preprint, for those of you who aren't aware, that's the version of a paper before it's undergoing peer review. So basically, if you say, okay, I'm submitting a paper to a journal or something along those lines, you can make it public immediately so that people can read it, so people have access to it, and it doesn't completely end up behind some paywall. And Open Science Framework, or the Center for Open Science, also hosts several of these preprint servers. So if you have any questions regarding the Open Science Framework, feel free to post them in the chat. For now, I will go to the next platform that I wanted to discuss, and that's CodeOcean. I think based on the responses that I got, this might be new for most of you. Do some journals have limitations that they do not accept preprints? That's a good question. As far as I know, most journals allow you to publish a preprint. There might be exceptions, but there is a website. I don't have it handy here, but I can somehow link it maybe back later. I'm not sure how it works, but there is a website where you can look for look up the journal and then see what exactly they allow in terms of publishing a preprint or publishing what they call postprints. So postprint is the version of the paper after it has undergone peer review, but not in the, let's say, fancy layout of the journal. So some journals also allow you or I would say most journals, at least in the field that I'm familiar with, also allow you to publish postprints. All right, thank you for the question. Now, a second platform I wanted to discuss is CodeOcean. So there is, as the name implies, is particularly relevant for people who are working with analysis code. The motivation for why I started using CodeOcean myself is twofold. First, at this point I have been using Open Science Framework for a number of years now, and I'm very, very happy with it. But when I look back to previous projects and I downloaded my data, downloaded my analysis code, and then ran the code back on that data, I sometimes ran into issues like errors. Code didn't no longer work because the name of the function was different, because certain arguments changed, or different default for certain arguments, stuff like that. And that was one reason. Another reason was that a reviewer of mine, of a paper of mine, suggested that I should use CodeOcean to make sure that my analyses are reproducible long term. And I thought that was a very good suggestion, so I looked into it, and I think it's yeah, potentially very useful platform. So the idea of CodeOcean is similar to Open Science Framework in that it allows you to upload data, to upload code. But now the idea is also that you can specify the environment, the computational environment. Which software am I using? Which packages am I using? And that sort of forms a capsule. And the idea is that in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, I can just go back to these capsules and again run it, and it should give you the same result over and over and over again. Also, if I share this with a collaborator who's working on a completely different machine, by accessing the capsule, they should still be able to reproduce my results exactly. So this is what it looks like on my end. So here I have a number of capsules. These are the published capsules. I also have a number of non-published capsules. So similar to Open Science Framework, you have the option to keep it private or make it public. And these are the published capsules of mine. If you look at one of them in particular, it's a little bit different compared to Open Science Framework in that it does come with a certain structure already. So it has a data component. Here it's a folder. It has a code component folder. And under these folders, you can upload your data files and your analysis code. And what it also has is this environment. So under environment, you can specify which software you're using, which packages are using, which versions you are using of these packages, etc. Now, for example, for this particular project, I was using R, and here you see the version of R. This is already quite an old version. So by now, if I wanted to run the code and I would just use the let's say, Open Science Framework where I uploaded the script and the data, I would potentially already run into issues because I use an old R version. I used some old package versions back then, or back then they weren't old, but at this point they're already a bit older. And some of these arguments changed, and then you run into issues and you have to figure out, okay, what argument changed, where is the issue, and then it just takes time. Here with CodeOcean, you can just specify these versions and it becomes, they sort of save it in that capsule, and allows you, if you press on this reproducible run button, it creates then, based on the code you upload, based on the environment and based on the data, it creates the same output every time. Now, I use this in combination with our Markdown. So one of you mentioned Jupyter, so that's also an option. So what's, I would say, comparable with Python. As far as I know, some of you might use SPSS, but that's commercial software, so I don't think it's possible within CodeOcean. Python and R, they are open source. So here I'm using R in combination with Markdown. So what this does is, for those of you who are not familiar with R, the gray bit here in the slides is R code, which is R syntax. And what I used to do was I did my analyses in R, And then I had my paper in Word or LaTeX or whatever. And I was just looking, okay, what are the results in my R output? And then I'm copying that in my Word file or whatever the case may be. Now, with something like R Markdown, you no longer have to do that. You're integrating your analysis with your text. So here I have my code, my analysis code, and here I have a bit of text. So this is actually the first part of a results section of a paper. So here it says, it is a sentence where I report sample size and percentage, for example. Instead of hard coding these numbers, I'm just referring to which object should you look for to fill in this number. So that way, if you now read the paper, which then would look something like this, you see a paper with numbers, you say, okay, this is an interesting number. Where does that come from? You can look at the R Markdown file and say, this is the object where it comes from. Where do I find that in the code? Okay, that's the way this was extracted or processed, or how it resulted from the data that was being read. So basically the idea is you have your R Markdown file, for example, but again, I'm just using R Markdown. You can use different kinds of software, but here I'm using R Markdown. Here I have my data. I specify in my environment the packages, the software versions, and then I click reproducible run, and this is what comes out of it. This is basically the preprint. So this is what you could send to a journal. And included somewhere is a link to CodeOcean, so that other people will be directed to this page and say, okay, I can also click reproducible run, or I can potentially clone this page, and I'm going to start playing around with this. I want to do some other analyses maybe on those data, and you can do that. You can also obviously share this capsule with collaborators. You can say, maybe I'm doing the analyses and another person is collecting data. And that's also an easy way to collaborate with one another in a transparent fashion. So that is what CodeOcean is about. Again, if you have any questions about this, feel free to post them either in the chat or towards the end of the presentation. For now, I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to move away from software and platforms and talk a bit about approaches and workflows. But before I do, I want to again ask you a question. So imagine you are going on a holiday and ignoring ecological considerations, you're taking a plane to your destination. But before you board, they announce that the co-pilot is sick and they will not be boarding. So it's only going to be the pilot. Would you be okay with boarding the plane yourself, or would you prefer to reschedule, take a next flight to your destination, or not go at all? So if you say, no worries, I'll take the plane with the pilot, just say yes. If you say, I would rather reschedule or not board the plane, say no. Or something else. Those of you who answered are not really likely or not inclined to take a plane without a co-pilot. I would agree. You may wonder what is the relevance of this question. Well, in science, in some situations, you could say we have a co-pilot, right? When we talk about thinking about a plan, thinking about what research question do we want to answer? How do we design a study to answer that research question? Typically, at least in my experience, you talk about this with collaborator, with a supervisor, with a co-supervisor. Also, when you have the results of a study, you talk about what these results mean, how to interpret them, what are the theoretical implications. And then when you write a paper, you send it to a journal, and then it typically undergoes peer review. So you have also peer reviewers are also in a sense the co-pilots in that they check, okay, does this make sense? Are the conclusions, do they logically follow from the results, etc. However, there is a part in the process where we don't have a co-pilot, at least in my experience. And that is when it comes to collecting and processing and analyzing data. When I was doing my research as a PhD student, or at any point in my career, I was typically the only one involved in data collecting, data processing, data analyzing. And it was just accepted that there wouldn't, or assumed that nothing could go wrong in that process. Maybe you have different experiences, but at least this paper suggests as well that this is common, at least in psychology, that in this part of the research cycle is the responsibility of just one person. Whereas Jelt Wichers suggested to adopt a co-piloting approach, meaning that you have another person checking the results based on the data, based on the methodology section. So it's a collaborator, it's someone, co-supervisor, supervisor, maybe someone from the stats department, whoever it might be, but it's a person part of the research team who would check the steps to see, okay, is everything clear? Maybe some aspect in the methodology is unclear, not clearly described. Maybe there was an error in some analysis, or the reporting of some analyses. And that co-pilot is meant to, correct these errors. So this is a way of collaborating to improve transparency and to hopefully reduce maybe the number of errors that are being reported or that end up in research reports. So this is collaboration on a relatively small scale. You maybe involve one other person, or that person is already part of the team. Here are some big team science approaches that I want to talk about. The first one is, again, specific to psychology, Psychological Science Accelerator. So the Psychological Science Accelerator is basically a network of researchers from across the world. So currently we have nearly 2,500 researchers from 73 countries. The idea is that researchers can propose a research question, a research project to the Psychological Science Accelerator. And if they deem it worthwhile, they will say, okay, we are going to now spread this across the different researchers across the different countries, and they can enter this collaboration. They can say, okay, I'm on board. I'm going to collect some data for this project. So the idea is that I'm, for instance, involved in one of these projects. All these researchers involved in the Psychological Science Accelerator can opt in and say, okay, yes, in exchange for co-authorship on this final paper, I'm going to collect a data set of a certain size. And for the project that I'm involved in, they're currently, that has translated into data for 30,000 people from different countries. And so that is a very rich data set, very representative data set. If you compare it to maybe some typical studies within the field where it's mostly, say, undergraduate students who have to participate in return for some course credit. So this is an approach where we have a collaboration to improve, let's say, representative samples, or to ensure that we have representative samples. Another big team science approach where the focus is more on the analysis part is referred to as the many analyst projects. So in contrast to the psychological science accelerator, where the idea is to have collaboration in terms of the data collection process, we now have a form of collaboration at the data processing and analysis part. So this is an example of a many analyst project from Silberstein and colleagues. So they invited people to answer a particular research question, again in exchange for co-authorship on the final paper. And the idea is to analyze a certain data set. Every research team that was invited did an analysis on the exact same data set to answer the exact same research question. In this particular case, the question was whether players with a dark skin tone were more likely to get a red card in soccer compared to players with a lighter skin tone. So for those of you who aren't familiar with soccer, if you get a red card in soccer, that means you're sent off the pitch, so that's a negative thing. So here you see the result of each of these 29 research teams that were involved in this study. So again, each of them analyzed the same data and to the best of their knowledge. And as you can see, so here in this graph, you see the result of each of these 29 teams. So every team found a point estimate, that's the dot, and a 95% confidence interval. That's the gray bar. For the gray dots, that means there is a non-significant effect. For the green dots, there is a significant effect. So, yeah, as you can see, there is quite a bit of variability there. But again, keep in mind, it's the same data and the same research question that they were answering. So this sort of relates to why it's relevant to do pre-registration, for example. There are different ways of processing and analyzing the data. There is not necessarily one right answer or one correct answer. And by doing a many analyst project, you have people thinking of thinking of their own way to analyze the data, and then collectively you can say something about the robustness of the effect. So if most research teams find a particular effect, for example, a significant effect or an effect of a certain size, then you can be relatively sure about, okay, this is a robust effect. Whereas if there is quite a bit of variability, some teams find a significant effect, others don't find a significant effect, or maybe an effect in a different direction, then you can say, well, this effect appears to be fairly fragile. It really depends on which approach you take to analyze and process these data. So this is another example of a big team science project, but this time with the focus on data processing and analysis. And finally, I want to talk about another specific kind of collaboration called adversarial collaboration. This is a term coined by Daniel Kahneman. And the idea is that researchers who disagree with one another on a particular theory, for example, come together and design a critical experiment. And the idea is that they both agree on the parameters of the experiment and both agree on, okay, if we observe this kind of outcome, it will support theory A. If we observe that kind of outcome, it will support theory B. So rather than what you might sometimes see in the literature, one author or group of authors putting forward a theory and their set of experiments, and then another group putting forward their theory, another set of experiments, and then again, the first group following up on that, and you have this kind of trail that doesn't really get resolved, or there is not always a clear conclusion there. So instead of that, these authors, or one author or a group of authors, come together and say, okay, we think it's best that we, even though we disagree, we are collaborating, we're designing a study to see, okay, to have more clear, let's say, clear conclusion, a clear picture for the reader. So, and this is often in collaboration with a third party who might be the neutral arbiter, the mediator. If sides really disagree on some things, they can sort of mediate and help come to a common ground. But the idea is that they develop an experiment that has to settle the difference, let's say. Of course, that doesn't mean if a particular party's theory would be rejected by the findings, that they necessarily concede and that they then say, well, after all, they're still people. They might find reasons as to why their preferred theory is still true, despite the evidence suggesting something else. Maybe there's some hidden moderator going on, and they might still think their theory is still correct. But at least for the reader, it's clear what everyone thinks, what was set out in advance, how they thought about in advance about this problem. And then the outcome. And every party has a chance to give their view on the outcome in an adversarial collaboration, and then it's up to the reader to decide, okay, how do I interpret this? I also want to briefly mention some of my own work in this area. So it has to do with adversarial collaborations for commentaries. So a few years ago, we wrote a paper, and then we got a commentary or received a request to review a commentary on our paper, as is often the case with the commentaries. And rather than writing then a reply to a commentary and then you have a reply to the reply, we thought, well, let's just see whether we can find a common ground and clearly map, okay, where do we agree, where do we disagree, rather than having a back and forth that doesn't result in anything. And so we had this let's say solution to the problem of reply to reply to reply for commentaries. So I think this is also a nice way to, collaborate with others in order to achieve a transparent conclusion that is helpful for everyone. All right, that was it for me. I have some websites. So the first one is the Open Science Framework. Second one is for CodeOcean, and the third one is the one for the Psychological Science Accelerator. And here are some references of the papers that I mentioned throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in chat, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. To me, it was really, really interesting. Some of the things you talk about, I didn't know them, so I'm really glad you are here today. So if there's someone who has some question, you can either write it into the chat or just raise your hand and ask your question, obviously. So let me see if in the chat there's some. So, for example, Tom, one of the software that you presented that I didn't know anything about was CodeOcean, and I believe it's really cool software, indeed. But I was wondering whether if is it possible to integrate in some way CodeOcean with other platforms, for example, for OSF. Is there a way to integrate and let's communicate these frameworks together, so I don't have to always manage one and then manage the others? So
Yeah, it's a good question. So I have gradually shifted a bit more towards using CodeOcean, like almost like exclusively, and less on open science framework.
Mm-hmm.
Mm, as far as I know, like precisely because CodeOcean is this capsule, right? You can of course say in your script, I want to download my data from this website, but like the open science framework. But of course, what if that website disappears, right? So that's why if you want to really have that sort of capsule, as CodeOcean does provide, you need those files there as well, right?
Mm-mm-mm.
Something that I also forgot to mention, that might be relevant regarding CodeOcean, is they too have like limits on file size and also limits on computation time. So it's a free platform. You have you have 10 hours of computation time per month. There are also ways to expand that, but then you have to pay a monthly fee. So what I do is I usually work offline, and then upload my scripts if I'm,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, ready to submit it to a journal or something like that on CodeOcean. But again, CodeOcean is also not the only way to achieve computational reproducibility. There are also other approaches to do that. But I'm mentioning it here because that's the one I'm most familiar with. Yeah, there are other ways as well. But yeah.
And another related question is CodeOcean considered as a repository? So a place where you can upload your materials and file, and then you share the unique identifier of the CodeOcean capsule and make it available to the audience. For example, putting into your article or manuscript. Is it acceptable by, for example, journals to use this kind of platform, which is, I think, less recognized than other repositories like GitHub or OSF?
Yeah. So far, I've had only positive experiences with journals and CodeOcean. So I can't really, I haven't encountered a situation or haven't heard of a story where there was negative feedback on using CodeOcean as opposed to maybe open science framework or whatever. Now, yeah, and also you can create a DOI.
Mm-hmm.
It's to a public. Obviously, then the capsule has to be public, right? But yeah, that is definitely possible. And yeah, again, it's mostly that feedback has mostly been positive because in my field, this is something that is unusual to have that kind. I mean, to have that reproducibility aspect as well. So yeah, there are a few journals that I know of that do these kind of checks themselves. But that's very, very rare as far as I know. So yeah, you can of course use it just as a data repository, but that is not necessarily the goal of CodeOcean. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I would also say that if it's sensitive data, I'm not working with that sense like that very sensitive data that cannot be publicly shared. But if you are working with them, then I would be a bit more hesitant about, even though the project is private, I would be a bit more hesitant to put the data on there, and maybe opt more for university repositories, for example. But yeah, that's just.
Can I ask you why?
Yeah, but it's just I feel that it's a little bit safer to have it on a university repository, but I guess it's just a personal preference. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Is there any question from the audience? Do you have any question?
I have a really small one. Also, CodeOcean was new for me too. So Michela asked a few of the questions I had, but thank you for sharing this with us. And the presentation in general was really interesting. Also the whole Copilot idea, the fact that actually, yes, there is a part of the work where there is less sharing or less confrontation with co-authors and with others about whether we're doing the right thing or there are better options or better ways to, for example, collect or analyze the data. So I really agree with how important that is. And I actually have a really small concrete question about what you showed in your our markdown feature, because I lagged a little bit. I wanted to ask if you could show us how you reference information in, like, how you use markdown to reference information from the code into the text you're writing. So it was really
yeah.
Okay.
So this is so you have regular text that looks like this. But for example, here you have this, so in Markdown, the start, so text between the stars that's very detailed, that's italicized text. And then when you say you want to refer to something R related, you have this backtick and then the letter R. And then this bit is basically an object in R. So it's something that you will find in the code. So it also has this different, slightly different font. Again, it might be hard to tell from the screenshot, but it's a slightly different font. This signals, okay, somewhere in the code, you should find an object that has this name.
Okay, so for example, you save a result from one of the functions, from some operation you did in the code. You can, for example, save it and then call it again within the text.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there any other question from the audience? Okay. So if there are no other questions, I'll share my screen and say a last few words. First of all, thank you very much again, Tom, for your attendance today and for your seminar, which I found really, really informative. And yeah, I really appreciate it. And I believe it's a common sense. So for you of the audience who ask for a certificate of attendance for today's seminar, you will have one. You receive one in the next 7 days. So keep waiting. And the next seminar, is actually on the March seminar. Sorry, I didn't change the date, but it's on the first Wednesday of March, and will be at the 3 p.m. And we will have Alexandra Sarafoglu, who will talk about a combined statistical thinking with open scientific practice, a protocol of a Bayesian research project. And so thank you very much to all of you for attending, and see you in March.